Hey guys, I can't tell you how much fun I had like doing our virtual meeting today. It was so good to see all you guys. I've really missed all of you. Um, and despite some of the pranks with your names and everything, it was so much fun. Well, that was fun too, but let's not do that again. Um, so just a little bit of a little summary of what we're gonna do over over the next week until, or you should do over the next week until we get to the AP test, and then we'll do our virtual lesson for the day. Um, you're going to work on your review sheet, the last review sheet, and then I want you guys before the test on Friday to definitely reread all your old review sheets so you guys are familiar with as much as which is which with this excuse me with as much of the material as possible. Remember, it's between the years 1754 to 1945 that the DBQ will be focused on. I want you guys to watch again the how to do the DBQ, how to do the UAP exam video again. Even if you've watched it before, I want you to watch it again before the AP test itself. Also, we'll have another virtual meeting next week. Probably the Thursday before you guys take the test, so I can answer any last minute questions or go over any last minute things that you guys want to discuss. Also, and don't worry about this yet. I mentioned this briefly today when we were all tuned in, but our final assignment. We're going to keep doing these videos up until the end of the semester. So I want you guys to keep watching the videos even after the AP test is over. Our your final project or assignment will be a term paper that's going to cover modern U.S. history, the stuff that we've covered in our video. So that will be your last assignment. That will be due be sometime in June. But don't worry about that yet. But make sure you guys keep watching these videos, okay, from start to finish. All right. So today we're going to keep talking about Lyndon Johnson. And remember, Lyndon Johnson became president after JFK was assassinated. He was committed to two big things: civil rights for blacks and ending poverty in the United States. So two huge goals. And in his first term, it's his small term. He was serving the rest of JFK's term. He got a major achievement. He got the Civil Rights Act passed, as well as some war on poverty initiatives. So this was a running start, but LBJ said, we are just getting started. We are going to build in his words, a great society to make sure that so many of the issues that have been neglected for so many years were finally going to be tackled, particularly regarding poverty and so many holes in our safety net. When we say safety net is a term that applies to government programs that exist to catch you if you fall, right? Like we need these safety net programs now more than ever, right? Unemployment insurance, for instance, which a lot of people are attempting to get, who lost their jobs after this horrible pandemic started. That's a safety net program that started with FDR in 1935. So that's just one example. LBJ wanted to greatly expand the safety net. Oh, I just see Kennedy has turned around. What's he doing? He's staring at Mark Twain. He wanted to aggressively expand the safety net. Okay, so when the 1964 election rolled around, the country was still grieving over President Kennedy's death, as you can imagine. Lyndon Johnson was nominated without any opposition for a term in his own right. There was a lot of pressure on Johnson to pick Bobby Kennedy as his vice president. Bobby Kennedy, remember, was JFK's brother, closest aide, closest friend, the Attorney General of the United States. But remember, we talked about in the other video, LBJ and Bobby Kennedy hated each other. So LBJ did not want to have to be stuck with Bobby Kennedy as his vice president. So he said, "I will not appoint any member of my cabinet I will not pick any member of my cabinet to be my running mate." So that excluded Bobby Kennedy because Bobby Kennedy was still serving as U.S. Attorney General at this time. When Bobby Kennedy actually went to the stage at the '64 Democratic Convention, he got a 15-minute standing ovation, literally 15 minutes of nonstop applause. And of course, this was in memory of his slain brother, as much more than it was about him necessarily. The Democratic Convention also witnessed a pretty ugly scene. It was held in Atlantic City, and the Mississippi delegation, two delegations arrived from Mississippi, one an all-white delegation and one called the Mississippi Freedom Party, which was a mostly black delegation. And there was this argument over which delegation would be seated at the convention as a legitimate delegation. Would it be the all-white one, or would it be the mostly black Freedom Party, led by a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer? And this was very heated. Finally, they decide, in the interest of party unity, to seat the all-white delegation while giving the Freedom Party just a couple of delegate seats. And a lot of people felt this was a major, especially on the left, felt this was a major sellout, that this all-white delegation should not be seated, especially when we had just passed the Civil Rights Act. So what's that all about? So that was kind of, that cast like a bit of a cloud over the Democratic Convention. But LBJ was nominated for president. He picked as his running mate my hero, Hubert Humphrey, senator from Minnesota, a champion of civil rights, who had presidential ambitions of his own, a great man, really committed to actually improving people's lives. And Humphrey was picked as LBJ's running mate, which perhaps you could argue Humphrey came to regret, because Humphrey was completely under the thumb of LBJ, who kind of made it his business to bully Humphrey at every opportunity. And especially in the sense of having to back all his policies, especially his controversial Vietnam policies, which we're going to talk about in subsequent videos. And that really hurt Humphrey when Humphrey himself later ran for president in 1968 among liberals. Now, the Republican Party was very divided in 1964. There was the moderate wing of the Democratic Party that wanted to nominate Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, and grandson of the legendary John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil. And the thing is that Rockefeller, in normal times probably would have been the nominee, but there was this resurgent conservative movement within the Republican Party that was becoming very, very strong. And the thing is that they were really, in many ways, the heart and soul of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was, especially by this time, becoming a pretty conservative party. And their hero was a man named Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a senator from Arizona. He wrote a book in 1960 called Conscience of a Conservative that made him a hero among the right. And the thing is that Goldwater kind of represented the huge grassroots of the Republican Party that really wanted to swing the party to the right. Nelson Rockefeller also had some problems of his own. Nelson Rockefeller had divorced his wife of over 30 years and quickly remarried. So it was pretty clear that this woman was kind of waiting in the wings, that they had been having an affair while he was still married, because the remarriage happened very quickly. And remember, America was still pretty conservative on these type of issues during this time. And the thing is that it looked like a wife swap. I divorced my wife, and then right after I married this new younger woman. So that really harmed Rockefeller. But also the fact that Rockefeller was a liberal. And that really put him out of step with the Republican Party, which was now swinging to the right. So Goldwater wound up winning the nomination in 1964 from the Republican Party. And Barry Goldwater gave a famous acceptance speech where he said, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Basically saying being extremist is not bad if you're doing for the sake of liberty. So this just reinforced, this made a lot of conservatives love him even more, but it made a lot of other Americans very fearful about, oh my God, what is this guy all about? He's basically admitting to being an extremist. Well, LBJ wanted a sweeping expansion of the power of the government to deal with the issues of poverty and civil rights. Goldwater wanted as little government involvement in American society as possible. He was I think more than a conservative, he probably could be best described as a libertarian. Somebody who just believed in very limited government. In fact, Goldwater, as an old man in the 1990s, got into some trouble with some conservatives because he was pro-choice on abortion, he's pro-gay rights, because he basically believed the government should just not be involved in people's lives. Either their pocketbook or their bedroom in the old libertarian expression. Now, one thing that made Goldwater different, perhaps, than other libertarian-minded people is that Goldwater favored a aggressively hawkish foreign policy, and he said a hard line must be taken against the communists. He made a joke where he said that we'd end the Cold War if we drop a bomb in the men's room of the Kremlin. That would end the Cold War. And also some other, that was a joke, but there were some other policies that Goldwater proposed that were really, really aggressive. He believed that nuclear weapons should be allowed to be used by field commanders, meaning a general could decide to call in a nuclear weapon as opposed to giving the president the final word on it. He suggested that in the emerging conflict in Vietnam that nuclear weapons could perhaps be used. I remember I don't remember, but I remember seeing a clip of it in the late 80s. They gave Goldwater was on TV and they asked him, Barry Goldwater, you're elected president in 1964. What would you have done in Vietnam? And he said, I would have sent my B-52 fleet over and I would have dropped nothing but pamphlets. And I would have told them that if they didn't stop the war, 3 days later, I'd have been back with nothing but bombs, and I'd have made a marsh out of North Vietnam. And the audience just stood there silently. And he said, but that would have ended that war. So it was a very aggressive foreign policy that Barry Goldwater was pushing. He also had voted against the Civil Rights Act, which had just been passed by Congress, saying that it wasn't because he's a racist, and no one really thought Goldwater was personally a racist, but he said that, well, if you have a diner or a lunch counter or a business, you shouldn't be forced to serve black customers if you don't want to. It's a property rights issue as opposed to being an issue about rights for blacks. But this won him a lot of support in the South, the fact that he had opposed the Civil Rights Act. But it was definitely some of his views on nuclear weapons that really scared Americans the most. His campaign slogan was, in your heart, you know he's right. And the Democrats just had a field day with that. They corrupted it. In your heart, you know he might. Referring to his views on nuclear weapons. Or they said, yes, far right. But perhaps the most insulting, Goldwater says, in your heart, you know he's right. But the Democrats corrupted that to, in your gut, you know he's nuts. And that's the way a lot of people felt about Goldwater, that his policies were just so aggressive and really out of step with the country. And the election results turned out to be a huge Lyndon Johnson landslide. Johnson, if we had in class, I would show you this to you, but Johnson had this infamous ad. It's called the Daisy ad. You should check this out on YouTube, where there was this little girl picking a flower, and she's just like, and she's kept picking the flower, and she's going 7, 9, 4, and then you hear in the background 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and then you see this giant mushroom cloud. And of course, implying that if Goldwater is elected, that we could have nuclear war. The ad was a 30-second ad. It only aired once, but it got free air coverage when it was shown on news programs. And it became the most famous ad of the 64 election, and probably one of the most famous political ads ever. And Johnson wound up winning a huge landslide, 61% of the vote to 38% of the vote to Goldwater. The electoral margin was huge, 486 electoral votes for Johnson to 52 votes for Barry Goldwater. So Barry Goldwater endured a smashing defeat in 1964. But despite the fact that this was really, really bad defeat for the Republican Party, if you were an optimistic conservative, there you could see some bright some silver linings to this really, really big defeat. For one, the solid South was broken. 47 of the 52 electoral votes that Goldwater did win were from the South. Goldwater won massive majorities in the South because of his opposition to civil rights and LBJ's embracing of civil rights. Johnson said when he signed the Civil Rights Act, we, being the Democrats, we've lost the South for a generation. And the thing is that, he was more than right. It's been over 2 generations, and the white South is still pretty much lost to the Democratic Party. Most white Southerners are Republicans. So he was definitely right on that. So for the Republicans, a solid South was broken. Which began the drift of the of the South away from the Democratic Party, which they had been attached to nostalgically because of the Civil War memories, into the arms of the Republican Party. That trend continued as the years went on. But Goldwater's nomination also foreshadowed the eventual conservative takeover of the Republican Party. The Republican Party actually, for decades, at least since the New Deal era, had been a fairly moderate party. There were certainly conservatives, a lot of conservatives in the Republican Party, but the party was still pretty much controlled by Eastern moderates. That was now really ending. And of course, the eventual conservative takeover of the Republican Party climaxed with Ronald Reagan, the former movie actor, governor of California, getting the nomination in 1980 and ultimately the presidency, which pushed the Republican Party all the way to the right. Also, the drift away from the East to the West. Barry Goldwater was from Arizona. Reagan and Nixon were from California. So the party was definitely moving away from Eastern moderation more toward the Sun Belt, where people had a lot more conservative views. And this also was the mobilization moment for the new conservative movement. So a lot of conservatives looked to 1964 as the moment when the movement really began. Maybe they lost badly, but it was the beginning of eventual conservative dominance of the party, and you could argue conservative dominance of American politics, which continues to this day in many ways. LBJ was also, interestingly, the last Democrat to ever win a majority of the white vote. No Democrat candidate for president since Lyndon Johnson has done that. The Republicans always win the majority of the white vote. And that wasn't just a Trump thing. That's true in every election since 1960, after LBJ, since 1968. LBJ could be a very partisan Democrat. In fact, he had this line where he said, the Democratic Party at its worst is better than the Republican Party at its best. The worst Democrat is better than the best Republican, which is a really, really interesting statement. Now, LBJ winds up elected to a sweeping re-election victory, and he had massive majorities in Congress. There were 68 Democrats in the Senate. That's over 2/3 majority in the Senate, and also 290 members of the House, which is about 2/3 of the House. So Johnson pretty much could get anything he wanted passed with these huge majorities in Congress. And now he was free to implement his vision of a great society. And what commenced was the period from 1965 to 1966 was the most productive legislative session in American history. 96% of what LBJ wanted passed, he got passed in Congress. That is an amazing record of achievement, right? No president has ever managed that, except maybe in the very, very beginning of FDR's administration. Now, the foundations of the welfare state were strengthened as a result of these great society initiatives being passed by LBJ. So let's talk about some of them. They revolutionized our country. LBJ established Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is health insurance for those over 65. Medicaid is health insurance for those who are poor. I'm always a little bit surprised LBJ didn't push for universal health care at this time, especially considering he was at the height of his powers. But old age insurance was generally something, and insurance for the very poor were generally seen as things that almost everybody could agree on, except the most conservative Republicans, Barry Goldwater and and those folks would not agree with it. Medicare and Medicaid to this day are still around as more important than ever, right? Bernie Sanders and a lot of liberal Democrats want to actually expand Medicare to cover everybody. Right now, it only covers people who are 65 and over. So Medicare and Medicaid were established. Housing assistance and rental assistance to low-income Americans was established. The Section 8 program, which gives poor people help paying their rents. The Housing and Urban Development (HUD) department was established by President Johnson. Johnson repealed all those restrictive immigration quotas in the 1920s. Believe it or not, they are still on the books. They were still on the books in the 1960s, that, deliberately trying to keep out certain groups of people. And when Johnson repealed these immigration quotas, that opened up the United States immigration from Latin America and Asia. And of course, that continues to this day, and that totally transformed the United States, right, into a multiracial country, right? Big waves of immigrants from Latin America and Asia began coming in after LBJ signed the repeal of the immigration quotas. The Higher Education Act, LBJ created the student loan program so kids could go to college. He started the work study program, so you could actually, when you guys get to college, you'll see that a lot of you guys will get jobs on campus and get paid for it. That was a program started by Lyndon Johnson. He created the National Endowment for the Arts to fund art. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which had the government fund PBS, Channel 13. And that is, very, very important. The Elementary and Secondary School Act. This meant that the federal government would now provide federal assistance to education. Before 1965, education was exclusively a responsibility of states and cities. But after 1965, now the federal government, began giving money to schools, especially something called Title I, which was federal money for poor schools. Even today, the federal government only provides 7% of the money from schools. Most school funding still comes to this day from the state and from the city. He created the Department of Transportation, more funding for mass transit. The Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which mandated seatbelts in cars. Before LBJ and the Great Society, seatbelts were not mandatory in cars, and if you got into a car accident, you were probably not going to survive. And the thing is, this changed America's roads and driving into something a lot more safe. Remember, there were 1 million car accident deaths in America by the 1950s. So you got into a car accident, it was a really, really serious matter. The gas tank was often near the engine. These cars were death traps if you got into an accident. That changed with the Great Society. Consumer protection laws, where fair labeling and packaging. So you have to actually show on the ingredients. You have to show on any item, what the ingredients are, how many calories it has, how many vitamins, how many fat, sugar, all that stuff. That was mandated now by Great Society programming. Truth in lending, where the banks actually have to tell you the interest rates before they give you a loan. They couldn't put in bitty language like they used to. They sometimes still do, kind of. But so you would now be aware about what interest rates were if you took out a loan. Major pieces of environmental legislation were passed by the Great Society. A book was published in 1962 called Silent Spring by a woman named Rachel Carson. And Ms. Carson talked about how chemicals are basically destroying our environment, particularly a popular pesticide called DDT, which was used a lot in the 1950s to kill insects, but it also got into the food chain and was killing off the bald eagle, America's symbol, and a lot of other animals. And this raised a lot more awareness about the environment. And LBJ signed the first laws to actually make it government responsibility to protect the environment. Johnson's wife actually made it her cause to beautify the nation's highways. She called it the beautification campaign. So all those things we talked about, that is an amazing record of achievement, right? These are things that are transformative, right? That changed American life. And in many ways, this surpassed the record of FDR and the New Deal. Because the thing is that the one thing you could say is the New Deal was passed as an emergency measure, right? FDR got a lot of the stuff passed because he said, look, there's a depression, it's an emergency. You have to just pass all these things. The 1960s was generally a time of prosperity economically. So the fact that LBJ was able to get all these things passed through Congress in a time of relative prosperity, I think makes it even more remarkable. Conservatives predictably denounced the Great Society. They said it was socialistic. They said it was making people more dependent on the government, and they said it's not winning, it's not ending poverty at all. Ronald Reagan had a line that he used when he was running for president in 1980. He said, "We declared war on poverty, and poverty won." Basically saying that liberal programs were totally ineffective. But that's really missing a lot of the big picture, because the poverty rate was 30% before the Great Society. It was cut in half. So it didn't end poverty, but it cut poverty in half. And you could argue that the reason why it didn't eliminate poverty was because when the Republicans got in, they began cutting a lot of these programs. So the Great Society, the fact that these pieces of legislation that we talked about, a lot of them are accepted today, aren't even controversial today, even among Republicans. It shows you just how just what a big thing LBJ did, what a massive achievement he had by passing these Great Society initiatives. At one point, he said, "I'm worried we're going to run out of problems to solve." Um, sometimes I wish we had someone like LBJ today, who would be able to kind of like, work his way through Congress, really understood the problems in American society, and really believed the government should be used to address these problems. Even though ultimately LBJ doomed his administration and his own Great Society by getting so stuck in the Vietnam War, which in many ways came to dominate LBJ's legacy, unfortunately. All right, guys, very good. So thank you for listening. Remember, watch all these videos from start to finish. I'll be sending you emails over the next week with various updates or announcements. And again, it was great seeing you guys, and I can't wait to see you again next week. All right, peace.